Every day, countless people walk past situations that could change everything with just a few spoken words. Most of us avoid confrontation, cross the street when we see trouble, or simply pretend we didn't notice. But what happens when an ordinary person decides that silence is an option? What happens when someone who looks completely harmless stands up to a group that thrives on intimidation? This isn't a story about superheroes or trained fighters. This isn't about someone with special powers or military training. This is about the kind of courage that can emerge from the most unexpected places, from the most unlikely people, at the most crucial moments. It's about how sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a fist or a gun, but simply knowing the right words to say at exactly the right time. The story you're about to read happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a small diner just off Highway 95. It involves a group of bikers who thought they owned whatever space they occupied, and a woman who proved that assumptions can be dangerously wrong. What started as routine harassment became a moment that would be talked about for years to come, all because of 6 simple words that carried more weight than anyone could have imagined. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories come from the most ordinary moments. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you'd never suspect. And sometimes, just sometimes, standing up to bullies requires nothing more than knowing exactly who you are and being brave enough to say it out loud. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Ruby's Diner, a small roadside establishment that had been serving travelers and locals for nearly 40 years. The red vinyl booths had seen better days. The linoleum floor bore the scuff marks of countless work boots, and the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. It wasn't much to look at, but it was honest food served by honest people, and that was enough for most folks who stopped by. Margaret Thompson sat in her usual corner booth, the one by the window that gave her a clear view of both the parking lot and the kitchen. At 62, she had the kind of presence that drew people's attention without her trying. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple blue cardigan over a white blouse. To anyone who glanced her way, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a retired teacher enjoying her afternoon coffee and apple pie. Margaret had been coming to Ruby's for the better part of 15 years, ever since she moved to this small town after her husband passed away. She knew every waitress by name, could tell you which cook was working based on how her eggs were prepared, and had become something of a fixture in the place. Ruby herself, now well into her 70s, always made sure Margaret's coffee cup stayed full and that she got an extra scoop of vanilla ice cream with her pie. The diner was unusually quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. A young couple sat near the front, sharing a basket of onion rings and whispering about wedding plans. An elderly farmer named Pete occupied his regular stool at the counter, working his way through a chicken fried steak while reading yesterday's newspaper. The waitress on duty was Sarah, a college student who worked part-time to help pay for her nursing school tuition. It was the kind of peaceful atmosphere that small-town diners are famous for, where the biggest excitement usually came from someone ordering something different from their usual. That peace was shattered at exactly 3:15 when the first motorcycle roared into the parking lot. Margaret looked up from her book, a mystery novel she'd been meaning to finish for weeks, as the sound of multiple engines filled the air. Through the window, she watched as 6 motorcycles pulled into the lot, their riders dismounting with the kind of deliberate swagger that said they were used to being noticed and liked it that way. The bikes were impressive machines, all chrome and black leather, the kind that cost more than most people's cars. The men who climbed off those bikes fit the stereotype perfectly. Leather vests displayed patches and colors that marked them as members of a motorcycle club, though Margaret couldn't make out the specific details from her vantage point. They were big men, most of them with arms covered in tattoos and faces that suggested they'd seen their share of trouble. Their leader seemed to be a man with a thick gray beard and arms like tree trunks, who gestured toward the diner entrance as if he were a general commanding his troops. Sarah, the young waitress, was cleaning glasses behind the counter when she noticed the group approaching. Margaret watched as the girl's face changed, her easy smile faltering as she took in the imposing figures walking toward the door. The couple near the front had stopped their wedding planning conversation, and Pete had turned around on his stool to see what was causing the commotion outside. The door opened with the chiming of the little bell that Ruby had installed decades ago, but somehow that cheerful sound seemed out of place as the 6 bikers filed in. They didn't just enter the diner, they claimed it. Their presence filled the small space in a way that made everything else seem smaller, quieter, less significant. The gray-bearded leader, who his companions called Tank, surveyed the diner like he was sizing up territory. His eyes moved from a young couple to Pete at the counter, then to Sarah behind the register, and finally to Margaret in her corner booth. There was something in that gaze that made it clear he was used to people being intimidated by him, and he enjoyed that power. The group settled into the booth directly across from Margaret, their voices loud and their laughter harsh in the previously peaceful space. They ordered coffee and sandwiches, but their attention wasn't really on the food. Tank kept glancing around the diner, making comments just loud enough for everyone to hear about how quiet the place was, how they might need to liven things up a bit. Margaret continued reading her book, but she was acutely aware of what was happening around her. She'd seen groups like this before, men who confused intimidation with respect and thought that fear was the same thing as admiration. They were testing the waters, seeing how far they could push before someone pushed back. Unfortunately, in a place like this with people like Sarah and the young couple and elderly Pete, there wasn't likely to be much pushback. The harassment started small, as it usually does. Tank made a comment about Sarah's appearance that was just inappropriate enough to make her uncomfortable, but not quite offensive enough for her to feel justified in calling him out. When she brought their coffee, one of his companions, a man with intricate tattoos covering his neck, made a joke about service with a smile that had undertones Sarah clearly didn't appreciate. Margaret watched it all unfold with growing concern. The young couple had finished their onion rings and were clearly trying to figure out how to leave without drawing attention to themselves. Pete had gone back to his newspaper, but his shoulders were tense, and he was reading the same paragraph over and over. Sarah was doing her best to maintain her professional composure, but Margaret could see the strain in her movements, the way her hands shook slightly as she poured coffee. This was how it always started. A group would come in and establish dominance through small acts of intimidation. They'd push boundaries bit by bit until they owned the space and everyone in it. Most people would endure it rather than risk confrontation, and the group would eventually move on, leaving behind a restaurant full of people who felt violated and helpless. Margaret had seen it happen before in different places and different circumstances. She'd watched good people get pushed around by bullies who counted on the fact that most folks would rather avoid trouble than stand up for what was right. She'd seen how that kind of behavior poisoned communities, making people afraid to go to places they loved, afraid to speak up when something was wrong. The bikers' behavior escalated gradually. Their voices got louder, their comments more pointed. Tank started making observations about the other customers that were clearly meant to be heard and to make those customers uncomfortable. He wondered aloud whether the young couple was old enough to be out without their parents. He suggested that Pete looked like he might need help cutting his steak. He made comments about the diner's decorations that were technically compliments, but delivered in a way that sounded like threats. Through it all, Margaret continued to sit quietly in her corner booth, her book open in front of her, her coffee growing cold. But her mind was working, processing what she was seeing, evaluating the situation and her options. She thought about the young couple, who were clearly too scared to enjoy what should have been a happy afternoon discussing their future. She thought about Sarah, who was just trying to earn money for nursing school and didn't deserve to be made to feel unsafe at her workplace. She thought about Pete, who had probably been coming to this diner longer than these men had been alive and shouldn't have to tolerate their disrespect. Most of all, she thought about Ruby, who had built this place into something special, a gathering spot for the community where people could come and feel welcome and safe. These men were violating that safety, turning a place of comfort into something threatening and unpleasant. The situation reached a tipping point when Tank decided that subtle intimidation wasn't enough anymore. He stood up from his booth and walked over to where Sarah was wiping down tables, positioning himself so that she couldn't easily move away from him. His voice was still conversational, but his words were clearly meant to frighten her. He started by complimenting her work ethic, but in a way that suggested he'd been watching her closely. He mentioned how nice it must be to work in such a quiet place where nothing exciting ever happened. He wondered aloud what would happen if things got a little less quiet, a little more exciting. His companions laughed at his comments, creating a chorus of male approval that made his words even more threatening. Sarah tried to maintain her professionalism, thanking him for his observations and attempting to continue with her work. But Tank wasn't finished. He reached out and touched her arm, not aggressively, but in a way that clearly crossed boundaries. He told her she seemed tense and suggested that she needed to relax to have a little fun. That's when Margaret closed her book. The sound was subtle, just the soft whisper of pages coming together, but somehow it cut through the noise in the diner. Tank glanced over at her, probably expecting to see another intimidated customer averting her gaze. Instead, he found himself looking into the calm, steady eyes of a woman who showed no signs of fear or submission. Margaret set her book aside and reached for her coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip while maintaining eye contact with Tank. Her movements were unhurried, confident, completely at odds with the nervous energy that had gripped everyone else in the diner. She looked like a woman who had just made a decision, and Tank seemed to sense that somehow the dynamics in the room had shifted. The gray-bearded leader straightened up, removing his hand from Sarah's arm as he focused his attention on this unexpected development. His companions noticed the change too, turning to look at the woman in the corner booth who had somehow managed to command their leader's attention without saying a word or making any kind of threatening gesture. Margaret finished her coffee and set the cup down carefully on its saucer. She smoothed her cardigan and checked her watch as if she was simply preparing to leave at the end of a pleasant afternoon. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she moved, that suggested this was far from over. Tank seemed puzzled by her lack of fear. He was used to intimidating people, used to seeing them shrink away from his presence. This woman's calm confidence was something outside his experience, and he wasn't quite sure how to respond to it. He took a step toward her booth, perhaps thinking that a closer look would reveal the fear he expected to see. Margaret looked up at him with the kind of mild interest she might show to someone asking for directions. Her expression was polite, but distant, as if she was evaluating whether he was worth her time. It was the look of someone who had dealt with difficult people before and found them more tiresome than threatening. The diner had gone completely quiet. Even the sound from the kitchen had stopped as Ruby's cook peered through the serving window to see what was happening. The young couple sat frozen in their booth, afraid to move or speak. Pete had given up all pretense of reading his newspaper and was watching the confrontation unfold. Sarah stood near the coffee machine, unsure whether she should try to defuse the situation or call for help. Tank was clearly struggling with how to handle this unexpected challenge to his authority. He couldn't simply ignore the woman, because that would look weak in front of his companions. But he also couldn't quite bring himself to directly threaten an elderly lady in a cardigan who looked like she could be someone's grandmother. His reputation was built on intimidating people, but this woman didn't seem intimidated. The standoff stretched for long seconds, with Tank standing beside Margaret's booth and Margaret looking up at him with that same calm, evaluating expression. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and everyone in the diner seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret reached into her purse, a simple black leather bag that had seen better days but was still serviceable. Tank tensed slightly, perhaps wondering what she might be reaching for. But Margaret's movements remained unhurried, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world and no concerns about the large, intimidating man standing beside her table. She pulled out a $20 bill and placed it carefully beside her coffee cup, smoothing out the wrinkles with the same attention to detail she might give to grading papers or arranging flowers. Then, she looked up at Tank again, her expression unchanged, still evaluating him as if he were a mildly interesting problem that required a practical solution. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with possibility. Everyone in the diner could sense that something significant was about to happen, but no one could have predicted what form it would take. Tank's companions were watching their leader, waiting for him to assert his dominance and put this strange woman in her place. Sarah and the other customers were hoping desperately that the situation wouldn't escalate into violence. Margaret stood up slowly, gathering her book and her purse with the same deliberate care she'd shown throughout the encounter. She was not a large woman, barely reaching Tank's shoulder, but somehow her presence seemed to fill the space around her. There was something about her bearing, something about the way she carried herself, that suggested depths that weren't immediately apparent. Tank found himself stepping back slightly to give her room, a movement that surprised him as much as anyone else. He was used to people making space for him, not the other way around. But there was something about this woman that commanded respect in a way he didn't quite understand, something that made his usual intimidation tactics feel suddenly inappropriate. Margaret picked up her $20 bill and walked calmly to the counter, where Sarah stood watching with wide eyes. She handed the money to the young waitress and smiled, the first time her expression had warmed since the bikers arrived. It was the kind of smile that teachers give to students they believe in, encouraging and confident. She spoke quietly to Sarah, her voice too low for anyone else to hear, but her words seemed to have an immediate effect. The young woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she managed a small smile in return. Margaret patted her arm gently, the same gesture Tank had used, but completely different in its intent and effect. Then Margaret turned to face the room, her gaze moving from the young couple to Pete to Tank and his companions. Her expression was calm, but serious, like someone about to deliver news that everyone needed to hear. The diner remained silent, every person focused on this small woman who had somehow managed to change the entire atmosphere without raising her voice or making a single threatening gesture. Tank found himself waiting for her to speak, curious despite himself about what she might say. His companions were equally focused, sensing that their leader's authority was somehow being challenged in a way they didn't understand. The young couple leaned forward slightly, hoping for some resolution to the tension that had ruined their afternoon. Pete had turned completely around on his stool, his newspaper forgotten. Margaret looked directly at Tank, her eyes meeting his without flinching or looking away. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and carrying, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear, but without any hint of aggression or fear. She spoke like someone who had every right to be heard and expected to be taken seriously. The moment had arrived when everything would change, when 6 simple words would transform a routine act of bullying into something none of them would ever forget. The words that came out of Margaret's mouth were so unexpected, so completely at odds with everything the bikers thought they knew about the situation, that for a moment no one moved at all. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet that had filled the diner moments before. This was the silence of shock, of minds trying to process information that didn't fit with their assumptions about reality. "I'm Judge Thompson's widow," Margaret said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being respected and believed. "He sent many of you away." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Tank's face went through a series of changes, from confusion to recognition to something that might have been fear. His companions exchanged glances, and Margaret could see the moment when understanding dawned on their faces. The name Thompson carried weight in this part of the state, especially among people who had found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Judge Harold Thompson had been a fixture in the regional court system for over 30 years before his retirement. He was known for being fair, but firm, a man who gave everyone a chance, but didn't hesitate to impose serious consequences when that chance was wasted. He had a particular reputation for dealing with motorcycle gangs and organized crime, having presided over several high-profile cases that had broken up criminal enterprises and sent their leaders to prison for long terms. More importantly, Judge Thompson had been known for his ability to see through lies and manipulation. He couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, and couldn't be fooled by sob stories or legal technicalities. When Harold Thompson sentenced someone, it stuck, and everyone involved knew they had been dealt with by someone who understood exactly who they were and what they had done. Tank's eyes widened as the pieces fell into place. He was staring at the widow of the man who had sentenced at least 3 members of his organization, including his own nephew, to significant prison terms. Judge Thompson had been the one who had looked Tank himself in the eye 15 years ago and told him that the next time he appeared in his courtroom, he would be going away for a very long time. Margaret watched the recognition spread across Tank's features with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. She wasn't gloating or threatening. She was simply stating a fact and allowing him to process its implications. The power in a room had shifted completely, but not because she had done anything aggressive or intimidating. She had simply revealed who she was, and that information changed everything. Tank's companions were looking at their leader, waiting for his response, but he seemed frozen in place. This was not a situation he had prepared for. Intimidating regular citizens was one thing, but confronting the widow of Judge Thompson was something else entirely. The judge might be gone, but his reputation remained, and his connections throughout the law enforcement and legal communities were legendary. Margaret had not moved from her position by the counter, but somehow she now seemed to occupy the center of the room. The other customers were beginning to understand that something significant had happened, even if they didn't know all the details. Sarah was looking back and forth between Margaret and Tank, seeing the change in the big man's demeanor, but not entirely sure what had caused it. The young couple near the front had stopped trying to be invisible and were now watching with open fascination as the dynamic in the diner continued to evolve. Pete had a small smile on his weathered face, the expression of someone who had lived long enough to appreciate seeing bullies get their comeuppance. Tank finally found his voice, but when he spoke, it was nothing like the loud, aggressive tone he had been using earlier. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, and there was actual respect in his voice, the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or forced. "I didn't know. We didn't mean any disrespect." Margaret nodded slightly, acknowledging his words, but not necessarily accepting them as sufficient. "Your behavior this afternoon suggests otherwise," she said, her teacher's instincts coming through in her tone. She wasn't angry, but she was clearly disappointed, and somehow that seemed worse than anger would have been. She gestured towards Sarah, who was still standing behind the counter, looking somewhat bewildered by the turn of events. "This young lady is working her way through nursing school. She comes here to earn honest money in a place where she should feel safe. Your presence has made that impossible." Tank looked towards Sarah, and for the first time since entering the diner, he seemed to actually see her as a person rather than a target for his entertainment. The young woman was indeed scared, but she was also strong and determined, the kind of person who was trying to build a better life for herself through hard work and education. Margaret continued, her voice remaining calm, but gaining strength. "That couple over there came here to plan their wedding. This should be one of the happiest times in their lives, but your behavior has turned their afternoon into an ordeal. They'll remember this day, but not for the reasons they should." The young couple in question were indeed listening to every word, and the woman had reached across the table to hold her fiancé's hand. They were beginning to relax as they realized that the situation was resolving in a way they hadn't expected. "And Pete there," Margaret said, nodding toward the man at the counter, "has been coming to this diner for longer than some of you have been alive. He's earned the right to enjoy his meal in peace, without having to worry about whether he might accidentally offend someone who thinks intimidation is a form of entertainment." Pete raised his coffee cup in a small salute to Margaret, his smile growing wider. He had indeed been coming to Ruby's for decades, and he had never seen anything quite like what was happening now. Margaret's gaze returned to Tank, and when she spoke again, there was steel in her voice despite its continued calm tone. My husband dealt with men like you for 30 years. He taught me to recognize the difference between those who made mistakes and learned from them, and those who chose to make intimidating others their way of life. Which category do you fall into? It was a question that demanded an honest answer, and Tank seemed to understand that this was not a moment for bluster or false bravado. He looked around the diner, taking in the faces of the people his group had intimidated, perhaps seeing them clearly for the first time. His companions were watching him, waiting to see how their leader would handle this unexpected challenge to his authority. The silence stretched for long moments as Tank wrestled with his response. Margaret waited patiently, like a teacher giving a student time to work through a difficult problem. She wasn't rushing him or trying to humiliate him further. She was simply waiting for him to make a choice about what kind of man he wanted to be in this moment. When Tank finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried to every corner of the diner. "We'll leave," he said, and there was no argument or negotiation in his tone. It was a simple statement of fact, an acknowledgement that he understood the situation had changed and that continuing to stay would be inappropriate. But Margaret wasn't finished with him yet. "Leaving isn't enough," she said, her voice taking on the tone she had once used when teaching particularly difficult students. "These people deserve an apology. Not because you're afraid of the consequences, but because it's the right thing to do." Tank's jaw worked for a moment, and Margaret could see him struggling with the request. Apologizing would mean admitting that his behavior had been wrong, which went against everything his persona was built on. His companions were watching to see if their leader would maintain his authority or submit to this unexpected challenge. Margaret waited, understanding that this was a crucial moment not just for Tank, but for everyone in the diner. The way this situation resolved would affect how these people felt about standing up to bullies in the future. If Tank could be made to understand the impact of his actions, it might prevent similar situations from occurring elsewhere. Finally, Tank turned towards Sarah, who was still standing behind the counter. "Miss," he said, his voice formal and serious, "I apologize for making you uncomfortable. That wasn't right." Sarah nodded, clearly surprised, but appreciative of the unexpected apology. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice still shaky but gaining strength. Tank then looked toward the young couple, who were holding hands and watching the proceedings with amazement. "Sorry for ruining your afternoon," he said, and while the words were simple, they seemed genuine. "Hope your wedding is everything you want it to be." The young man spoke up for the first time since the bikers had arrived. "Thank you," he said, squeezing his fiancée's hand. "That means a lot." Finally, Tank turned to Pete, who was still sitting at the counter with his coffee cup raised. "Sir," Tank said, and there was real respect in his voice now. "Didn't mean to disturb your meal. This place seems like somewhere special." Pete set down his cup and nodded thoughtfully. "It is," he said simply. "Always has been." Margaret watched these exchanges with approval, but she wasn't done yet. "Apologies are a good start," she said, "but they need to be backed up by changed behavior. Ruby's Diner has been serving this community for 40 years. It's a place where people should feel welcome and safe. I trust that if any of you return here in the future, you'll remember that." Tank nodded, understanding the implicit warning in her words. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the formality of his response showed how completely the power dynamic had shifted. "We understand." Margaret picked up her purse and book from the counter, her movements still calm and deliberate. "Good," she said. "Then perhaps this afternoon wasn't entirely wasted." She walked toward the door, passing close to Tank and his companions. As she did, Tank stepped aside to give her room, a gesture of respect that would have been unimaginable when he first entered the diner. His companions followed his lead, creating a path for her to pass through. At the door, Margaret paused and turned back to face the room. "Sarah," she called to the young waitress, "keep working hard. The world needs more good nurses." To the young couple, she added, "Enjoy planning your wedding. These should be magical times." And to Pete, she said, "Save some pie for next week. Ruby makes the best apple pie in 3 counties." Then she looked at Tank and his group one last time. "Gentlemen," she said simply, and there was a world of meaning in that single word. It was both an acknowledgement of their potential to be better and a reminder of the standard they should strive to meet. Margaret pushed open the door and walked out into the afternoon sunshine, leaving behind a diner that was utterly transformed from the one she had entered hours earlier. The bell chimed cheerfully as the door closed behind her, and for a moment everyone inside remained frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. Tank was the first to move, pulling out his wallet and laying money on the table to cover his group's order. He left more than enough, perhaps as another form of apology or maybe as a way to support the business they had disrupted. His companions followed his lead, gathering their things and preparing to leave. As they filed toward the door, Tank paused at the counter where Sarah was standing. "That lady," he said quietly, "she's something special, isn't she?" Sarah nodded, still somewhat in shock from the entire encounter. "She comes in here all the time," she said. "Always polite, always tips well. I never knew who she was married to." "Judge Thompson was a good man," Tank said, surprising Sarah with the admission. "Fair but tough. He gave people chances, but he didn't tolerate nonsense." He paused, looking around the diner one more time. "Seems like his wife is the same way." With that, Tank and his companions left the diner, the sound of their motorcycles starting up and pulling away marking the end of one of the most unusual confrontations Ruby's diner had ever seen. The aftermath was immediate and profound. The young couple found themselves able to laugh again, returning to their wedding plans with renewed enthusiasm and a story they would tell for years to come. Pete finished his meal in peace, occasionally chuckling to himself as he remembered the look on Tank's face when Margaret revealed who she was. Sarah began cleaning up with a spring in her step, amazed at how quickly the entire atmosphere of the diner had changed. Ruby emerged from the kitchen, having watched most of the proceedings through the serving window, and immediately began asking what had happened and how Margaret had managed to defuse such a potentially dangerous situation. But perhaps the most significant change was in the diner itself. The space that had felt threatened and violated just minutes earlier now felt safe and welcoming again. Margaret's intervention had done more than just resolve a single incident. It had reaffirmed the diner's identity as a place where people could gather in comfort and security. Outside, Margaret walked slowly to her car, a modest sedan that she had driven for years and maintained meticulously. She didn't hurry or look over her shoulder to see if the bikers were watching. She moved with the same calm confidence she had displayed inside the diner, as if confronting groups of intimidating men was something she did every Tuesday afternoon. As she drove away, Margaret reflected on the encounter and its resolution. She thought about her late husband Harold and the lessons he had taught her about standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. She thought about the look of relief on Sarah's face and the way the young couple had been able to return to their happiness once the threat was removed. Most of all, she thought about the power of truth and how sometimes the most effective weapon against intimidation was simply being honest about who you were and what you stood for. Tank and his companions had counted on everyone in the diner being too frightened or too powerless to challenge them. They hadn't counted on encountering someone who carried the authority of 30 years of judicial experience and the moral clarity that came from a lifetime of distinguishing right from wrong. The 6 words she had spoken had changed everything, not because they were threatening, but because they revealed a truth that reframed the entire situation. She wasn't just an elderly woman in a cardigan. She was the widow of Judge Harold Thompson, a man whose reputation for fairness and firmness had earned respect even from those he had sentenced. That revelation had transformed her from a potential victim into someone who commanded authority and demanded respect. As Margaret drove home to her small house on the edge of town, she was already thinking ahead to next Tuesday, when she would return to Ruby's for her usual coffee and pie. The diner would be back to normal, a peaceful place where people could gather and enjoy each other's company without fear or intimidation. But the story of what had happened that afternoon would live on, told and retold by everyone who had been there. It would become part of the diner's history, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely people can be heroes, and that standing up to bullies doesn't always require physical strength or angry words. Sometimes it just requires knowing who you are and being brave enough to say it out loud. The encounter had lasted less than an hour, but its effects would ripple through the community for years to come. People would remember the day when Judge Thompson's widow stood up to a motorcycle gang with nothing but 6 words and the moral authority that came from a lifetime of doing what was right. And somewhere on the highway, Tank was having his own thoughts about the afternoon's events, wondering how a routine stop for coffee had turned into a lesson about respect, dignity, and the unexpected places where real authority can be found. The news of what happened at Ruby's Diner spread through the small town with the speed that only small-town news can achieve. By evening, half the community had heard some version of the story, though the details varied, depending on who was doing the telling. Some versions had Margaret single-handedly facing down 20 bikers. Others claimed she had pulled out a badge and identified herself as a federal agent. But the core truth remained consistent. Judge Thompson's widow had stood up to a group of intimidating men and sent them away with nothing more than the power of her words. Sarah's version was the most accurate, since she had been closest to the action and had heard every word clearly. When she arrived home that evening to the small apartment she shared with her roommate Jessica, she was still processing what she had witnessed. Jessica, who was studying to be a social worker, listened with growing amazement as Sarah recounted the afternoon's events. "You're telling me this woman just looked at them and said she was Judge Thompson's widow, and they all backed down?" Jessica asked, struggling to believe such a simple confrontation could have such dramatic results. "It wasn't just what she said," Sarah explained, sitting cross-legged on their small couch with a cup of tea warming her hands. "It was how she said it, like she knew exactly who she was and wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. When she told that guy Tank that her husband had sent many of them away, you could literally see his face change. It was like she had cast a spell or something." Jessica shook her head in wonder. "I've heard about Judge Thompson. My criminology professor mentioned him several times. Apparently, he was legendary for not taking any nonsense from defendants or their lawyers. Fair, but absolutely uncompromising when it came to justice." "She had that same quality," Sarah said thoughtfully, "like she could see right through all the tough guy posturing to what was really going on underneath. When she made them apologize, it wasn't because she threatened them or yelled at them. It was because she made them see that what they were doing was wrong." The young couple from the diner, Mark and Jennifer, had their own version of the story to tell. They had gone straight to Jennifer's parents' house after leaving Ruby's, still energized by the unexpected turn their afternoon had taken. Jennifer's mother listened with growing concern as they described the initial intimidation. But by the time they reached Margaret's intervention, she was leaning forward with fascination. "Mrs. Thompson did that?" she asked, clearly surprised. "I know her from the library board. She's always so quiet and polite. I would never have imagined her confronting a gang of bikers." "Mom, you should have seen her," Jennifer said, her eyes bright with excitement. She was absolutely fearless. Not aggressive or anything, just completely calm and in control. When she told them who she was, it was like watching someone flip a switch. These big, scary guys suddenly turned into schoolboys who had been caught misbehaving. Mark nodded enthusiastically. "It completely changed how I think about courage," he said. "I always thought being brave meant being willing to fight or take risks. But what Mrs. Thompson did was different. She was brave enough to be honest about who she was and to demand that people treat others with respect." Jennifer's father, who had remained quiet through most of the story, finally spoke up. "Your Judge Thompson presided over my brother's trial about 20 years ago," he said thoughtfully. "My brother had gotten mixed up with some bad people, and we all thought he was going to prison for sure. But the judge took the time to really understand his situation gave him a chance to make things right. Change his whole life around. He paused, remembering. The judge could have thrown the book at him, and probably should have according to the law. But he saw something worth saving in my brother and structured a sentence that focused on rehabilitation instead of just punishment. Takes real wisdom to know when to be merciful and when to be firm. The story reached Pete's ears through his weekly poker game, which took place every Tuesday evening at the American Legion Hall. Pete had finished his meal at Ruby's and gone straight to the game, where he found himself the center of attention as he recounted the afternoon's unusual events. So there I am, minding my own business with my chicken fried steak, Pete told his fellow card players, when in walks this bunch of bikers looking like they own the place. Started hassling young Sarah, making everyone nervous. I'm thinking maybe I should say something, but what's an old coot like me going to do against 6 guys half my age? His friends leaned in as he continued. Then Mrs. Thompson, who's been sitting there quiet as a mouse reading her book, just stands up and tells them who she is. Boom! Game over. These tough guys suddenly can't apologize fast enough. Charlie, who had known Judge Thompson professionally as a court clerk, shook his head in admiration. That woman has more steel in her spine than most people have in their whole body, he said. I worked with the judge for 15 years, and I can tell you he married well. She was always there supporting him, especially during the difficult cases. What kind of difficult cases? Asked Tom, the newest member of their poker group. Oh, the judge handled some serious organized crime cases, Charlie explained, dealing the next hand. Motorcycle gangs, drug operations, white-collar crime rings. He put away some dangerous people who had a lot of money and connections. There were times when security had to be increased around the courthouse because of threats. Pete's eyes widened. I never knew it was that serious. Most people didn't, Charlie said. The judge and his wife didn't talk about it publicly, but they lived with that danger for years. Takes a special kind of courage to stand up to that kind of pressure, knowing that the wrong decision could put your family at risk. Meanwhile, Ruby herself was processing the day's events in her own way. She had called her daughter Linda in the neighboring city to tell her about the incident, partly because Linda always worried about Ruby working at the diner, and partly because the story was too remarkable not to share. You should have seen her, honey, Ruby told Linda over the phone while she sat in her small office behind the kitchen. Mrs. Thompson transformed that whole situation just by being herself. Didn't raise her voice, didn't make threats, just spoke the truth, and let it do the work. Linda had been concerned about her mother's safety at the diner for years, especially as Ruby aged, and the world seemed to become more unpredictable. Weren't you scared? She asked. What if those men had become violent? You know, I probably should have been, Ruby admitted. But watching Mrs. Thompson handle the situation, I never felt like violence was really a possibility. She had a way of defusing the tension just by her presence. It was like having a master teacher take control of an unruly classroom. Ruby looked around her office, which was decorated with photos from 40 years of running the diner. Pictures of regular customers, local high school sports teams she had sponsored, community events the diner had catered. This place has always been about bringing people together, she continued. Mrs. Thompson understood that and was willing to protect it. Not many people would have done what she did. The story eventually reached the local newspaper, though in a much quieter way than such dramatic events usually would. Jim Martinez, who wrote the community interest column for the weekly paper, heard about the incident from 3 different sources and decided it was worth investigating further. He called Margaret directly, having looked up her number in the phone directory. When he explained that he had heard about the incident at Ruby's and wondered if she would be willing to share her perspective, Margaret was polite but firm in her response. I appreciate your interest, she told him, but I don't think it's necessary to make a big story out of this. Sometimes people just need to be reminded of how to treat each other properly. The men involved learned something, and that's what matters. Jim persisted gently. Mrs. Thompson, what you did took remarkable courage. People in the community are inspired by your actions. Don't you think that's worth sharing? Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering. If you write about it, she finally said, please focus on the importance of standing up for others, not on me personally. And please emphasize that those young men did the right thing in the end. They apologized and left peacefully. That shows character. The article that eventually appeared was brief and understated, focusing on the community spirit displayed at Ruby's Diner and the importance of treating all people with respect. It mentioned the incident only in general terms, noting that sometimes conflicts can be resolved through honest communication rather than confrontation. Margaret was identified simply as a longtime community member who had helped defuse a tense situation. But the real impact of the story wasn't in any newspaper article. It was in the changes that began occurring in the daily life of the community. Sarah found herself standing a little straighter at work, more confident in dealing with difficult customers. The experience of watching someone stand up to intimidation without resorting to aggression had given her a new model for handling challenging situations. The young couple, Mark and Jennifer, incorporated the story into their wedding planning in an unexpected way. They decided to have Margaret do a reading at their ceremony, wanting her calm strength and wisdom to be part of their special day. When they approached her with the request, she was genuinely surprised and touched. "I would be honored," she told them when they visited her small house the following weekend. "But why me? We barely know each other." "Because of what you showed us," Jennifer explained. "You demonstrated what it means to stand up for what's right, not just for yourself, but for other people. That's the kind of marriage we want to have, where we protect and support each other and the people around us." Margaret's influence extended beyond individual reactions to broader changes in how the community functioned. Ruby noticed that her regular customers seemed more willing to speak up when they witnessed inappropriate behavior. The previous week, when a traveling salesman had been rude to one of the waitresses, 3 different customers had politely but firmly told him his behavior was unacceptable. "It's like Mrs. Thompson gave everyone permission to stand up for what's right," Ruby told her Tuesday morning coffee group, a collection of early rising retirees who gathered at the diner each week. "People seem to understand that you don't have to be mean or aggressive to set boundaries." Margaret herself seemed largely unaware of the impact her actions had created. She continued her regular routines, visiting the library twice a week, grocery shopping on Fridays, and having coffee at Ruby's every Tuesday afternoon. When people approached her to talk about the incident, she was gracious but clearly preferred to focus the conversation on other topics. However, those who knew her well could see subtle changes. Her friend Dorothy, who had known Margaret since she first moved to town, noticed that she carried herself with even more confidence than before. "It's like she reminded herself of who she is," Dorothy observed to another friend. "Margaret has always been strong, but I think standing up to those men reminded her of her own power. She's not just the judge's widow anymore. She's Margaret Thompson, and that's somebody in her own right." The bikers themselves had their own version of events to process. Tank, whose real name was Robert Morrison, found himself thinking about the encounter repeatedly in the days that followed. He had called his lawyer that evening, not because he feared legal consequences, but because he wanted to understand more about Judge Thompson and his reputation. Harold Thompson was one of the most respected judges in the state, his lawyer told him. Even among defense attorneys, he was known as someone who would give you a fair hearing, but wouldn't tolerate any nonsense. He sent a lot of people away, but he also gave a lot of second chances to people who deserved them. What about his wife? Tank had asked. I never met her personally, but I heard she was very supportive of his work. They were married for over 40 years, and she was with him through some very difficult cases. The kind of woman who would have had to deal with threats and pressure, but never backed down from doing what was right. The conversation had given Tank a new perspective on the afternoon's events. He began to understand that his group hadn't just encountered a random elderly woman. They had faced someone whose entire adult life had been spent dealing with people like them. Margaret Thompson had probably sat through countless trials involving motorcycle gangs and organized crime figures. She had heard every excuse, every threat, every attempt at intimidation that men like him could devise. More importantly, She had seen which of those men could be reached with reason and which were beyond help. Her calm confidence hadn't come from naivety about the potential for violence. It had come from experience in distinguishing between those who were truly dangerous and those who were simply trying to look dangerous. This realization led Tank to make some decisions about his own behavior and that of his group. He called a meeting of the local chapter and told them about the incident, using it as an opportunity to discuss the kind of reputation they wanted to have in the community. "We can be tough without being bullies," he told his companions. "We can command respect without terrorizing innocent people." What happened at that diner showed me that real strength doesn't come from making people afraid of you. It comes from being someone who deserves respect. The changes in Tank's group were gradual but noticeable. They began making an effort to be better community members, participating in charity rides, and avoiding the kind of intimidating behavior that had characterized their previous public appearances. When they stopped at restaurants or bars, they made sure to be polite to staff and respectful to other customers. It wasn't a complete transformation, and not all members of the group embraced the new approach with equal enthusiasm. But Tank's leadership and the memory of their encounter with Margaret Thompson created a new standard for how they conducted themselves in public. The incident at Ruby's Diner had become more than just a story about one woman standing up to a group of bullies. It had become a catalyst for examining how communities function, how individuals can make a difference, and how respect and dignity can be maintained even in challenging situations. Margaret's actions had demonstrated that courage doesn't always look like what people expect it to look like. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply be honest about who you are and refuse to be intimidated by people who are trying to make you afraid. Sometimes standing up to bullies requires nothing more than the willingness to speak truth and the confidence that comes from knowing you have every right to be respected. As the weeks passed, the immediate drama of the incident began to fade, but its lessons remained. Ruby's Diner returned to its usual peaceful atmosphere, but with an added sense of security that came from knowing the community would protect what was important to them. The regular customers felt more connected to each other, bonded by their shared experience, and by Margaret's example of how to respond to threats against their collective well-being. Margaret continued her routine of Tuesday afternoon coffee and pie, though she now found herself greeted more warmly by staff and customers alike. She remained humble about her role in the incident, consistently deflecting praise and redirecting attention to the importance of everyone looking out for each other. But privately, she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that she had honored her late husband's memory by standing up for justice and protecting those who needed protection. Harold would have been proud of how she handled the situation, and that knowledge gave her a sense of peace and completion that she hadn't expected to find. The story of what happened at Ruby's Diner would continue to be told for years to come, becoming part of the local folklore and serving as a reminder that heroism can emerge from the most unexpected places. It was a story about the power of truth, the importance of standing up for others, and the remarkable things that can happen when someone refuses to be intimidated by those who mistake fear for respect. Most importantly, it was a story about the lasting impact one person can have when they choose to act with courage and integrity in a moment when action is needed. Margaret Thompson had changed more than just one afternoon at a small-town diner. She had changed how an entire community thought about strength, courage, and the responsibility each person has to protect the dignity and safety of others. 3 weeks after the incident at Ruby's Diner, Margaret received an unexpected phone call that would provide her with a deeper understanding of just how far-reaching the effects of that Tuesday afternoon had become. The caller was Detective Maria Santos from the state police, who had heard about the incident through law enforcement channels and wanted to meet with Margaret to discuss something important. They arranged to meet at Margaret's home on a quiet Friday afternoon. Detective Santos was a woman in her early 40s with an air of professional competence that reminded Margaret of her late husband's approach to his work. She was direct but respectful, clearly someone who understood the weight of authority and how to use it appropriately. Mrs. Thompson, Detective Santos began as they sat in Margaret's modest living room, surrounded by photos of her 43-year marriage to Harold. What you did at that diner has had effects that reach far beyond your local community. I wanted you to understand the significance of your actions. Margaret poured tea and settled back in her favorite armchair, the same one where she had spent countless evenings listening to Harold discuss his cases and the challenges of balancing justice with mercy. "I'm not sure I understand," she said. "I simply told some rude men who I was and asked them to behave appropriately. Detectives Santos Milet. It was considerably more than that, and the results have been remarkable. The man you confronted, Robert Morrison, known as Tank, has been a person of interest in several investigations over the years. He's the leader of a regional motorcycle club that has flirted with criminal activity, but never quite crossed the line into anything we could prosecute successfully." She pulled out a small notebook and consulted it briefly. "Since your encounter with him, we've noticed significant changes in his organization's behavior. They've stopped the intimidation tactics they used to employ at businesses throughout the region. They've begun participating in legitimate charity activities. Most importantly, they've started providing information to law enforcement about actual criminal organizations operating in the area." Margaret set down her teacup, surprised by this information. "Are you saying that conversation somehow convinced him to cooperate with police?" "In a manner of speaking, yes," Detective Santos replied. "Our sources tell us that Morrison was profoundly affected by meeting you. He apparently spent considerable time after that incident researching your husband's career and reputation. He learned about cases where Judge Thompson had given second chances to people who demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to change." The detective paused to let this sink in before continuing. "Morrison seems to have concluded that he and his organization were at a crossroads. They could continue down a path that would eventually lead to serious criminal charges, or they could use your husband's approach as a model for how to turn their lives around." Margaret thought about this, remembering Tank's face when he realized who she was. She had seen something shift in his expression, a recognition that went beyond simple fear of consequences. "My husband always believed that people could change if they were given the right motivation and the right example," she said thoughtfully. "He used to say that sometimes all it took was showing people who they could become instead of just punishing them for who they had been." "Exactly," Detective Santos said. "And apparently your encounter with Morrison demonstrated those principles in action. He saw someone who could have had him arrested or intimidated, but instead chose to give him an opportunity to do the right thing. The fact that he took that opportunity suggests that your husband's approach to justice was indeed effective." This conversation led Margaret to reflect more deeply on Harold's career and the principles that had guided his work on the bench. That evening, she went through his study for the first time since his death 2 years earlier, looking through the journals he had kept and the letters he had received from people whose lives had been affected by his decisions. What she found surprised her. Harold had documented case after case where his approach of firm but fair justice had led to positive outcomes for defendants, victims, and the community as a whole. There were letters from former defendants who had turned their lives around, from victims who appreciated his balanced approach to sentencing, and from attorneys who respected his commitment to true justice rather than mere punishment. One journal entry, dated about 10 years earlier, caught her attention particularly. Harold had written about a case involving a young man charged with assault after a bar fight. The defendant had a history of minor infractions, but nothing violent, and Harold had sensed that this incident was more aberration than pattern. "Gave him a choice today," Harold had written. 6 months in jail, or 6 months of community service plus anger management counseling plus restitution to the victim. He chose the harder path, which tells me something about his character. Sometimes the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but whether they're willing to do the work to make things right. Margaret read through more of these entries, gaining new insight into her husband's judicial philosophy and the careful thought he put into each decision. She began to understand that what had happened at Ruby's Diner wasn't just about her standing up to bullies. It was about continuing Harold's work of showing people that they had choices and that taking the harder, more honorable path was always possible. This understanding motivated Margaret to take a more active role in her community. She began volunteering at the local literacy center, helping adults learn to read and write. Many of her students were people who had made mistakes in their lives and were trying to build better futures for themselves. Margaret found that Harold's approach to justice translated perfectly to teaching. Firm expectations combined with genuine support and the unwavering belief that people could change. One of her students was a young man named David who had recently been released from prison after serving time for burglary. He was struggling to find work because of his criminal record and was considering giving up on his attempts to build a legitimate life. Mrs. Thompson, he told her one afternoon after a particularly difficult lesson, maybe this isn't worth it. Maybe people like me don't get second chances. Margaret looked at him with the same steady gaze she had given Tank at the diner. David, she said, my husband used to say that the world is full of people waiting for others to fail so they can feel better about their own shortcomings. But the world also has people who believe in redemption and second chances. Which kind of person do you want to be around? She leaned forward slightly. More importantly, which kind of person do you want to be? Because every day you choose to come here and work on improving yourself, you're proving that second chances aren't given. They're earned. David continued with his studies and eventually earned his GED. 6 months later, he found a job at a local construction company whose owner believed in giving people second chances. At David's graduation ceremony, he made a point of thanking Margaret not just for teaching him to read better, but for helping him understand that his past didn't have to determine his future. Meanwhile, the changes in Tank's organization continued to ripple through the region. Detective Santos kept Margaret informed of their progress, and the news was consistently positive. The group had formally changed their name from a motorcycle club to a motorcycle association, dropping the aggressive imagery that had characterized their previous identity. They had begun organizing charity rides for local causes and had developed a reputation for being helpful rather than intimidating. More significantly, they had started a mentoring program for young people who were at risk of getting involved in criminal activity. Tank himself had become involved in speaking at schools about the choices he had made and the consequences they had led to. His message was simple. Respect and strength didn't come from intimidating others, but from taking responsibility for yourself and helping others do the same. One afternoon, almost 2 months after the incident at Ruby's diner, Margaret was surprised to see Tank walking up the path to her front door. She watched through her window as he approached, noting that he looked different somehow. He was still a large, imposing man, but he carried himself with less aggressive swagger and more quiet confidence. When she opened the door, he removed his baseball cap and stood respectfully on her front porch. Mrs. Thompson, he said, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to talk to you about something. Margaret invited him in and offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully. They sat in her living room, an unlikely pair whose previous encounter had led to this unexpected follow-up conversation. I wanted you to know, Tank began, that what happened at the diner changed things for me and my group. We've been trying to be better, to contribute to the community instead of just taking from it. Margaret nodded encouragingly. I've heard about some of your activities. The charity work you've been doing sounds wonderful. It feels good, Tank admitted. Better than the other stuff we used to do. But I wanted to ask you something. I've been reading about your husband, about the way he handled cases. I found some old newspaper articles about trials he presided over. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. There was one case about 15 years ago, a young man charged with assault and drug possession. The judge could have sent him away for years, but instead he structured a sentence that focused on rehabilitation and community service. That young man was my nephew, Mrs. Thompson. Your husband saved his life. Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this information. I remember Harold talking about that case, she said slowly. He was concerned about a young man who seemed to have gotten caught up with the wrong people, but hadn't committed any violent crimes before. That's right, Tank said. My nephew had fallen in with some bad people, started using drugs, got into a fight while he was high. But Judge Thompson saw something in him that the rest of us had given up on. The sentence he imposed was tough. 2 years of supervised probation, drug treatment, community service, regular check-ins with a counselor. But it worked. Tank's voice grew emotional as he continued. My nephew is a paramedic now. He's married, has 2 kids, completely turned his life around. All because your husband believed he could change and gave him the structure and support to do it. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to this story. Harold would be so pleased to know how things turned out, she said softly. That's why what happened at the diner hit me so hard. Tank continued. When you said you were Judge Thompson's widow, I realized I was looking at the wife of the man who had saved my nephew's life. And there I was, acting like the kind of person your husband spent his career trying to stop. He looked around the room, taking in the photos and mementos of Harold's career. I wanted to thank you, not just for what you did that day, but for supporting your husband's work all those years. I know being a judge's wife couldn't have been easy, especially with some of the dangerous people he had to deal with. Margaret smiled, remembering the challenges they had indeed faced together. Harold used to say that justice wasn't something one person could achieve alone. It required a community of people committed to doing what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. She paused, then added, what you've done since our encounter, the changes you've made in your organization, the community work, the mentoring program, that's exactly what Harold meant. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about creating a community where everyone has the opportunity to be their best self. Tank stood to leave, but before he reached the door, he turned back to Margaret. Mrs. Thompson, would it be all right if I brought my nephew by some time? I think he'd like to meet the wife of the judge who changed his life. I would be honored to meet him, Margaret replied. And Tank, thank you for proving that people can change. Harold always believed it was possible, but it means everything to see that he was right. After Tank left, Margaret sat in her living room thinking about the conversation and its implications. Harold's work had continued to influence lives years after his retirement and death, but through ripples and connections she had never imagined. The incident at Ruby's Diner had been about more than just standing up to bullies. It had been about connecting with Harold's legacy and discovering new ways to carry his values forward. This realization led Margaret to make a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. She contacted the local community college and proposed teaching a class on conflict resolution and community building. Her approach would combine Harold's judicial philosophy with her own experience in education, focusing on practical ways to build stronger, more respectful communities. The class was popular from the beginning, attracting people from all walks of life who were interested in learning how to handle difficult situations more effectively. Students included business owners who wanted to deal better with problem customers, parents struggling with teenage children, and community leaders looking for ways to address local conflicts without resorting to legal action. Margaret's teaching style reflected both her educational background and her life experience with Harold. She emphasized the importance of understanding different perspectives, the power of clear communication, and the necessity of treating all people with dignity and respect. She used case studies from Harold's career, with permission from those involved, to illustrate how conflicts could be resolved in ways that strengthened rather than divided communities. One of her favorite examples was the story of her encounter with Tank and his motorcycle group. She used it to demonstrate how understanding someone's story and giving them an opportunity to make better choices could lead to outcomes that benefited everyone involved. Conflict resolution isn't about winning, she would tell her students. It's about finding solutions that allow everyone to maintain their dignity while moving toward a better outcome. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be intimidated while also refusing to be intimidating. The success of Margaret's class led to requests for her to speak at other community organizations and events. She found herself becoming a voice for practical wisdom and community building, roles she had never expected to fill but that felt natural and fulfilling. Through all of these activities, Margaret remained grounded in the values that had guided her marriage to Harold and her life as an educator. She never forgot that her strength came not from her position or her husband's reputation, but from her commitment to treating others with respect and her willingness to stand up for what was right. The incident at Ruby's diner had revealed to Margaret that she possessed a form of authority and influence she hadn't fully recognized before. But more importantly, it had shown her how to use that influence in ways that honored Harold's memory while making a positive difference in her community. As she reflected on the months since that Tuesday afternoon confrontation, Margaret realized that standing up to Tank and his companions had been about much more than one moment of courage. It had been the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she could actively continue the work of building a more just and respectful community that she and Harold had always believed in. The 6 words she had spoken that day, "I'm Judge Thompson's widow. He sent many of you away," had indeed changed everything. But perhaps the most important change had been in Margaret herself, as she discovered new ways to carry forward the principles and values that had guided her life with Harold and would continue to guide her in the years to come. 6 months after the incident at Ruby's Diner, the annual community festival was taking place in the town square. It was a tradition that brought together people from all walks of life to celebrate their shared community with food, music, and various local organizations setting up booths to showcase their work. Margaret had been attending the festival for years, but this year she found herself participating in a way she never had before. The Literacy Center had asked her to run a booth highlighting their adult education programs, and Margaret had agreed, though she was surprised by how many people stopped by specifically to talk to her. Word of her work in conflict resolution and community building had spread, and people were curious about the woman who had become something of a local legend. What surprised Margaret most, however, was seeing a booth set up by Tank's Motorcycle Association. They were running a fundraiser for a scholarship program they had established for young people who wanted to pursue careers in public safety: police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and emergency medical technicians. Tank himself was there, along with several members of his group, talking with families and explaining their mission. Margaret watched from her booth as Tank interacted with community members, noting how different his demeanor was from that first day at Ruby's. He was still a large, imposing man, but his presence now radiated confidence rather than intimidation. When a young boy approached their booth with obvious curiosity about the motorcycles on display, Tank knelt down to the child's level and patiently explained the safety features and mechanical workings of the machines. Later in the afternoon, Tank made his way over to Margaret's booth. The festival was winding down, and the crowds had thinned somewhat, giving them an opportunity to talk without interruption. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, offering her a respectful nod, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did that day at the diner. Our scholarship program just awarded its first grants to 3 local young people. None of this would have happened without that conversation." Margaret smiled, genuinely pleased by this news. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," she said, "but the credit belongs to you and your organization. I simply reminded you of who you could choose to be." Tank looked around the festival, taking in the scene of families enjoying themselves, local businesses showcasing their services, and community organizations working together for the common good. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I spent a lot of years thinking that respect came from making people afraid of you. But what I've learned is that real respect comes from being someone worth respecting." He gestured toward his booth, where his nephew was now talking with a teenager interested in becoming a paramedic. "My nephew is here today as one of our volunteer mentors." Seeing him talk to these kids about the opportunities available to them, knowing where he came from and where he is now, that's what real strength looks like. Margaret followed his gaze and saw a confident young man in his early 30s wearing a paramedic's uniform, animatedly describing his work to a fascinated audience of teenagers and their parents. Harold would be so pleased to see how his decision affected not just your nephew's life, but how it's now affecting other young people through your program. Speaking of which, Tank said, I've been wondering if you might be willing to serve on our scholarship selection committee. We need people who understand how to evaluate character and potential, and I can't think of anyone more qualified than you. Margaret considered the request. It would mean working closely with Tank's organization, something she would never have imagined possible 6 months earlier. But she had seen the sincerity of their transformation and the positive impact they were having on the community. I would be honored, she said, but I have one condition. I want to make sure that these scholarships go to young people who might not otherwise have opportunities. Kids who have made mistakes but show genuine commitment to turning their lives around. Tank smiled broadly. Mrs. Thompson, those are exactly the young people we want to help. Kids like my nephew was who just need someone to believe in them and give them a chance to prove they can do better. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah, the young waitress from Ruby's Diner, who approached the booth with a man Margaret didn't recognize. Sarah was wearing her nursing school uniform, having just finished a clinical rotation at the local hospital. Mrs. Thompson, Sarah said excitedly, I wanted you to meet my instructor, Professor Williams. I told him about what happened at the diner, and he said he'd heard about your conflict resolution class at the community college. Professor Williams, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, shook Margaret's hand warmly. Mrs. Thompson, I've been hoping to meet you. Several of my students have mentioned how much they learned in your class. I'm wondering if you might be interested in developing a more formal curriculum that we could offer as part of our nursing program. Margaret was intrigued. How would conflict resolution fit into nursing education? Healthcare workers deal with stressed, frightened, and sometimes angry patients and families every day, Professor Williams explained. The techniques you teach for de-escalating situations and finding peaceful resolutions could be incredibly valuable in medical settings. We've seen too many situations where conflicts between staff and patients or families escalated unnecessarily. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Mrs. Thompson, the way you handled those bikers at the diner, that's exactly the kind of skill we need when dealing with difficult situations in the hospital. You showed us that you don't have to be aggressive to be strong. Margaret found herself agreeing to work with a nursing school to develop a specialized curriculum. It was another way to extend Harold's philosophy of justice and fairness into new areas of community life, and she was excited by the possibilities. As the festival continued to wind down, Margaret noticed Mark and Jennifer, the young couple who had been at the diner that day, approaching with an older woman Margaret recognized as Jennifer's mother. The couple was now married, having had their wedding 3 months earlier where Margaret had indeed done a reading as they had requested. Mrs. Thompson, Jennifer said warmly, I want you to meet my mom properly. Mom, this is the woman I told you about who stood up to those bikers. Jennifer's mother, whose name was Carol, smiled and took Margaret's hands in both of hers. My daughter has told that story so many times, I feel like I was there myself. But what she might not have mentioned is how much that experience influenced their wedding ceremony. Margaret looked puzzled, so Mark explained. We decided to include a commitment in our vows about standing up for each other and for other people when it mattered. What you did that day showed us what it means to be brave when someone needs help. We also made a donation to the Literacy Center in your honor instead of giving out traditional wedding favors, Jennifer added. We wanted our wedding to celebrate not just our love for each other, but our commitment to being the kind of people who make our community better. Margaret was touched by this gesture, but before she could respond, Carol spoke up. Actually, Mrs. Thompson,